It began not with a public decree, but with a quiet intervention, one that unfolded behind closed doors at Clarence House, where Princess Anne reportedly confronted a growing concern that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. The tension was unmistakable. Something had shifted. And at the centre of it all stood Frogmore Cottage. What once symbolized reconciliation was now being quietly redefined as a liability. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the unease was subtle, almost imperceptible to those outside the inner circle. Frogmore Cottage, once presented as a gesture of goodwill, a bridge between fractured relationships, had begun to take on a different meaning within palace walls. It was no longer just a residence tied to memory and compromise, it had become a symbol. And symbols within the monarchy carry weight far beyond their physical presence. Behind closed doors, conversations reportedly grew sharper, more deliberate, as senior figures began to question whether maintaining that connection still served the institution's carefully guarded image. Princess Anne, known for her unflinching pragmatism and loyalty to the crown above all else, is said to have been among the first to voice what others hesitated to articulate. During a private royal council discussion, her concerns reportedly cut through the polite silence that often shields difficult truths. The issue was not merely about property, nor was it rooted in personal grievance, it was about perception, about the delicate balance between tradition and modern scrutiny. In a world where every royal association is dissected, every symbol interpreted, Frogmore's continued link to Harry and Meghan began to appear increasingly complicated. Advisors, too, were allegedly growing uneasy. Internal discussions, once cautious and measured, reportedly began to include more direct language phrases like optics risk and symbolic contradiction, quietly entering the conversation. How could the monarchy maintain a unified front, they questioned, while a property so closely tied to its legacy remained connected to figures who had publicly stepped away from royal duties? The contradiction was not lost on those tasked with protecting the institution's long-term credibility. It was not just about what Frogmore represented in the past, but what it now signaled to a watching world. As these concerns intensified, whispers of lease restructuring reportedly began to circulate within the inner corridors of power. At first, they were just that, whispers, fleeting suggestions exchanged in cautious tones. But whispers, within the royal framework, have a way of evolving. They gather momentum, drawing in more voices, more perspectives, until they can no longer be dismissed as mere speculation. Each conversation seemed to build upon the last, layering urgency over uncertainty, until the question was no longer if something needed to change, but how and when. And beneath it all, there was a deeper tension, one that could not be easily resolved through policy or paperwork. Frogmore Cottage had once stood as a gesture of inclusion, a quiet acknowledgement that despite distance and disagreement, there remained a place within the royal fold. To reconsider its status was to reconsider that message entirely. It was a shift not just in logistics, but in meaning, in narrative, in the very story the monarchy was telling about itself. Because what had started as a quiet concern was no longer contained within private walls. It was growing, evolving, pressing against the boundaries of discretion. And as those early whispers began to take shape, one truth became increasingly impossible to ignore: Frogmore was never just a home. Long before it became Harry and Meghan's residence, Frogmore Cottage carried a meaning far more profound than its modest exterior might suggest, a meaning shaped not by headlines, but by history, by quiet decisions made across generations, and by an unspoken understanding that some places within the royal orbit are never merely assigned, they are entrusted. That distinction, subtle yet powerful, has long defined Frogmore's place within the Windsor estate. It was not simply a house offered for convenience, it was part of something deeper, something woven into the monarchy's enduring narrative of continuity, privacy, and control. And it is precisely that layered significance that has now transformed what once seemed like a routine arrangement into a dilemma echoing far beyond its walls. For decades, Frogmore existed in the background of royal life, quietly embedded within the sacred geography of Windsor, a space where history is not displayed but preserved, where meaning accumulates in silence rather than spectacle. It has long been associated with moments of retreat and reflection, a place where the monarchy could step away from the public gaze without ever stepping outside its own, carefully maintained boundaries. To be given access to such a space was never just about residency. It was about inclusion, about trust, about being allowed into a circle defined as much by discretion as by duty. That is what made its later assignment so symbolically charged, even before the world began to pay attention. Then came the renovations, extensive, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Undertaken under royal oversight yet scrutinized through a public lens, they added a new layer of complexity to Frogmore's identity. What had once been a quiet, almost invisible part of the estate was suddenly thrust into a broader conversation about cost, accountability, and purpose. Every detail seemed to carry weight, every decision interpreted as a reflection of larger institutional priorities. And as the property evolved physically, so too did its symbolic resonance, becoming a focal point where private royal tradition intersected with modern public expectation. Yet beneath all of this lay a structural truth that insiders suggest was never ambiguous, even if it was rarely spoken aloud. The lease attached to Frogmore was not designed as a permanent claim, but as a conditional arrangement, one that, at its core, was tied to role, responsibility, and active participation within the royal framework. It was a principle embedded in the monarchy's long-standing approach to privilege. Access is granted, but it is also contingent. And while that understanding may have once existed quietly in the background, it has now moved unmistakably to the forefront. As circumstances shifted and roles were redefined, the question that had once seemed theoretical began to take on urgent clarity. Could a property so deeply embedded within the monarchy's symbolic landscape remain connected to those no longer operating within its active structure? The issue was no longer just administrative, it had become philosophical, even existential in its implications. Because Frogmore, in all its history and quiet power, represented more than a residence. It represented alignment. It represented belonging. And as that realization began to settle within palace discussions, it brought with it an unavoidable tension, one that could not be resolved through tradition alone, nor ignored. In the face of evolving realities, because the very principle that had defined Frogmore's significance, this delicate bond between duty and privilege, was now being tested in ways the institution could no longer sidestep. And it was that very principal duty tied to privilege that would soon collide head-on with a reality the palace could no longer avoid. What insiders would later describe as a quiet fracture did not erupt overnight. It formed slowly, almost invisibly, stretching across years of distance, silence, and shifting roles until, by early 2026, it could no longer be contained beneath the surface. The turning point did not arrive with a single announcement or a dramatic confrontation, but through a growing chorus of unease that began to echo within the institution itself. At the center of it all was a contradiction that had become increasingly difficult to ignore. Frogmore Cottage, once a symbol of inclusion and continuity, was now tied to figures who had stepped beyond the day-to-day responsibilities of royal life. And that dissonance, subtle at first, had begun to sharpen into something far more consequential. The physical distance between Harry and Meghan and the royal core had long been acknowledged, even accepted, as part of an evolving narrative. But distance, within a structure built on presence and duty, carries meaning beyond geography. It shapes perception, it redefines allegiance, and as the years passed, that distance began to take on a symbolic weight that extended far beyond personal choice. The monarchy, bound by tradition yet constantly scrutinized by a modern audience, found itself navigating an increasingly fragile balance, one where every association, every retained privilege, was measured against an expectation of visible contribution. At the same time, the media landscape intensified the pressure, amplifying every nuance of the situation. Narratives grew louder, more pointed, framing the continued connection to Frogmore as more than just a logistical detail. It became a talking point, a symbol, a question mark, hanging over the institution's ability to maintain internal coherence. Each headline, each analysis, seemed to push the issue further into the spotlight, transforming what had once been an internal consideration into a matter of public interpretation. And within the palace, that external scrutiny began to mirror internal conversations that were becoming harder to deflect. Behind closed doors, discussions reportedly shifted in tone. What had once been cautious and hypothetical began to take on a sharper edge, with insiders allegedly debating the implications of what some described as inactive asset holding. It was a phrase that carried both technical and emotional weight, hinting at a deeper concern about fairness, precedent, and the integrity of the system itself. If one connection remained intact despite a clear departure from active duty, what would that signal to others? What boundaries would it blur? And more importantly, what expectations would it quietly dismantle? The question of precedent loomed heavily over these conversations. The monarchy, after all, does not operate in isolated decisions. Each choice reverberates, shaping the framework within which future actions are judged. Allowing one exception could open the door to others, gradually eroding the clarity that had long defined the institution's structure. And for those tasked with safeguarding that structure, the stakes were becoming impossible to ignore. This was no longer just about Frogmore. It was about the rules themselves, about whether they could bend without breaking. As the tension deepened, whispers from within the palace began to carry a new kind of urgency. There was talk, insiders suggested, of a line needing to be drawn, a moment where ambiguity would give way to definition, where the institution would have to assert, clearly and decisively, what it stood for. But drawing such a line was never going to be simple. It meant confronting not just policy, but emotion, not just tradition, but change. And as those conversations edged closer to inevitability, one truth became undeniable: the fracture was no longer quiet. It was widening, pressing, demanding resolution. But drawing that line would require more than discussion. It would demand decisive action from someone willing to enforce it. Princess Anne has long been known as the monarchy's most unyielding enforcer, a figure defined not by spectacle but by discipline, by a quiet refusal to allow emotion to override duty. Yet what reportedly unfolded behind palace walls suggested something far more calculated, far more decisive than her already formidable reputation implied. This was not simply a matter of raising concern or voicing discomfort. According to multiple interpretations circulating within royal circles, Anne moved beyond observation and into action, initiating what some insiders now describe as a structured push toward resolution, one that brought Frogmore's uncertain status into sharp, unavoidable focus. For those who have watched her over decades, the move was both surprising and entirely predictable. Anne has often been described as the guardian of protocol, a role she neither claims publicly nor denies, but one she has consistently embodied through her actions. Where others deliberate, she defines. Where others hesitate, she clarifies. And in moments when the institution begins to drift into ambiguity, she has a history of pulling it back toward structure, toward rules that are not merely followed but enforced. It is within this context that her reported involvement begins to take on deeper meaning, not as an isolated intervention, but as part of a broader pattern of safeguarding the monarchy's internal coherence. Insiders suggest that her approach was neither impulsive nor confrontational, but methodical. Rather than framing the issue as a personal or emotional dispute, she is said to have pushed for a formal review of property allocations, shifting the conversation away from individuals and toward systems. It was a subtle but powerful reframing. By placing Frogmore within a wider context of royal assets and responsibilities, the discussion could no longer remain confined to a single case. It became part of a larger question. How should privilege be structured within a modern monarchy, and who determines its limits? As this perspective gained traction, what had once been informal discussions reportedly began to crystallize into something more structured. A process emerged quietly at first, almost imperceptibly, an internal mechanism designed to assess alignment between property use and active duty. Some have described it as an audit, others as a review, but those closest to the situation hint at something more deliberate, more enduring. It was not just about resolving one issue, it was about establishing a framework that could prevent future contradictions from taking root. Within this evolving structure, alignment among senior figures began to solidify. Anne's position, it is said, found quiet resonance with others who shared her focus on institutional consistency. William, increasingly central to the monarchy's future direction, reportedly recognized the long-term implications of leaving such questions unresolved. Edward, often operating with understated influence, is also believed to have supported the need for clarity. Together, this alignment did not manifest as a public alliance, but as a shared understanding and unspoken agreement that the institution could not afford to blur its own boundaries. Out of these converging perspectives, a concept began to take shape, one that insiders have referred to in hushed tones as the Iron Protocol. It was not an official doctrine, not a document to be circulated or announced, but rather a guiding principle, a commitment to reinforcing the link between duty and privilege. With a firmness that left little room for interpretation, it signaled a shift from flexibility to definition, from accommodation to accountability. And once such a principle begins to form within the monarchy, it does not remain theoretical for long. Because the moment a protocol is conceived, it demands application. It seeks its first test, its first moment of enforcement. And as the framework around Frogmore continued to tighten, the implications became impossible to ignore. What had begun as a quiet initiative was now evolving into something far more consequential, something that would not only address a single property, but redefine the boundaries of royal entitlement itself. And once that protocol was set into motion, there was no turning back, because the consequences would ripple far beyond a single property. The moment came without ceremony, without spectacle, without even the kind of acknowledgement that might hint at its magnitude, but its impact was unmistakable, reverberating quietly through the corridors of an institution that rarely acts without intention. What had once been discussed in fragments, in cautious tones and carefully chosen words, had now solidified into something final. Reports began to surface suggesting that a decision regarding Frogmore's lease had been reached through internal consensus. Not imposed, but aligned. Not declared, but understood. And at the heart of that consensus, many believe, was the steady, unrelenting influence of Princess Anne, her earlier insistence on clarity, now culminating in an outcome that could no longer be deferred. This was not a decision framed in emotion, nor one driven by public pressure alone. It was presented, at least internally, as institutional, rooted in principle rather than personality, in structure rather than sentiment. Frogmore, once held up as a gesture of reconciliation, had now been quietly repositioned within a different narrative, one that prioritized coherence over compromise. The shift was subtle in its execution, but profound in its meaning. Where once there had been flexibility, there was now definition. Where once there had been accommodation, there was now alignment. Insiders suggest that the language surrounding the move was carefully crafted, emphasizing not separation but consistency. The phrase alignment with duty reportedly became central to internal messaging, reinforcing the idea that access to royal assets must reflect active participation within the institution's framework. It was a recalibration, not just of a single arrangement, but of the underlying philosophy that governs how privilege is granted and maintained. And in that recalibration, Frogmore ceased to be an exception. It became an example. Yet beneath the measured tone of institutional reasoning, there lingered a deeper undercurrent, one that spoke to the emotional weight of what was unfolding, because this was not merely about a lease, nor even about a property. It was about redefining the boundaries of belonging, about drawing a line that had long been resisted but could no longer be avoided. The decision, once taken, carried with it an inevitability that could not be softened, no matter how carefully it was framed. It signaled that the monarchy, faced with mounting contradictions, had chosen clarity over ambiguity, even at the cost of altering relationships that once seemed unbreakable. As the internal consensus translated into action, whether through termination, restructuring, or some carefully negotiated middle ground, the implications began to ripple outward. The philosophy governing royal asset control had shifted, almost imperceptibly at first, but with consequences that would extend far beyond Frogmore itself. This was no longer about managing a single situation. It was about establishing a precedent, one that would shape future decisions and redefine expectations for years to come. And as is often the case with such shifts, the outside world did not remain unaware for long. Subtle signals began to emerge, fragments of information that hinted at what had taken place behind closed doors. The media, ever attuned to changes within the royal narrative, started to piece together the story, drawing connections, asking questions, sensing that something significant had occurred. What had been contained within the palace was beginning to seep into public consciousness, carrying with it both curiosity and consequence. Because even as the institution moved to present the decision as measured and necessary, the broader implications could not be entirely controlled. They were already unfolding, already being interpreted, already shaping perceptions in ways that extended beyond official messaging. And as that narrative began to take on a life of its own, one truth became increasingly clear: the decision on Frogmore was not an endpoint. It was a beginning, but while the palace moved to contain the narrative, the wider implications were already beginning to surface. In the aftermath, what remained was not merely the quiet resolution of a property question, but something far more profound, a rupture that cut through layers of history, expectation, and unspoken understanding. Those closest to the institution suggest that the decision surrounding Frogmore did not end with paperwork or protocol. It lingered. It settled into conversations that were harder, more personal, and far less structured than the process that produced it. Because when a symbol is redefined, the impact is never confined to the symbol alone. It reaches into relationships, into identity, into the fragile architecture that holds the monarchy together. For Harry, the shift was perceived by many as more than logistical. Frogmore had represented a point of return, a quiet anchor to a place that, despite everything, remained part of his story. To see that connection formally altered, whether through termination or restructuring, carried a weight that could not be measured in legal terms. It spoke of finality, of distance no longer framed as temporary or negotiable, but as something more enduring. And within royal circles, that perception alone was enough to alter the emotional landscape in ways that no official statement could fully contain. For Charles, the moment was said to carry its own complexity, shaped by the intersection of duty and fatherhood. The monarchy demands clarity, demands consistency, demands decisions that protect the institution even when they strain personal bonds. Yet those bonds do not simply disappear. They linger, quietly complicating every step forward. Insiders suggest that this tension between what must be done and what is felt has become one of the defining undercurrents of the current reign, surfacing in moments like this, with a force that cannot be easily dismissed. And then there is William, positioned not only as a brother, but as the future of the institution itself. The shifting dynamics between him and Harry have long been the subject of speculation, but within this context, they take on a sharper edge. Because the decision on Frogmore was not just about the present, it was about the future shape of the monarchy, about the standards that will define it in years to come. And in that sense, every action carries a dual meaning, addressing immediate concerns while also setting the tone for what lies ahead. Within the palace, there is said to be an acknowledgement, quiet but unmistakable, that this moment marks the beginning of a new phase. The language may remain measured, the messaging carefully controlled, but beneath it all is a recognition that something fundamental has shifted. The institution is tightening, drawing its boundaries with greater precision, reinforcing the link between role and privilege with a firmness that leaves less room for ambiguity. It is a recalibration that may bring clarity, but also carries the risk of deepening divides that have yet to fully heal. And as these changes take hold, a broader narrative begins to emerge, one that extends beyond individual relationships and into the identity of the monarchy itself. Is this a necessary evolution, a strengthening of structure in an increasingly complex world, or is it the quiet closing of doors that once allowed for flexibility, for reconciliation, for return? The answer, for now, remains elusive, suspended somewhere between intention and consequence. Because even as the dust begins to settle, the echoes of what has unfolded continue to reverberate, shaping conversations that are far from over. The decision may have been made, the process completed, but its meaning is still being understood, still being felt. And within those lingering questions, one thought refuses to fade, pressing itself into the silence that follows every great shift. What comes next? What has emerged in the wake of this decision is far more than a quiet adjustment within royal property. It is the unmistakable outline of a new royal order, one that no longer tolerates ambiguity where clarity is required. Observers suggest that this moment has drawn a firm line through years of blurred boundaries, reinforcing a structure where the distinction between working and non-working members is no longer implied, but defined with precision. The era of flexible interpretation appears to be giving way to something sharper, something more deliberate, where privilege is no longer inherited by association alone, but sustained through visible alignment with duty. And within that shift lies a deeper transformation, one that reaches beyond Frogmore and into the very framework of how the monarchy understands belonging. At the heart of this recalibration is a renewed emphasis on accountability, a principle that has quietly gained momentum within the institution. The idea that royal assets, roles, and privileges must exist in harmony is no longer a philosophical stance, it is becoming operational. Figures like Princess Anne, Prince William, and Prince Edward are believed to have played a defining role in shaping this direction, not through dramatic declarations, but through steady influence, aligning the monarchy with a future that demands coherence as much as tradition. And as this framework takes hold, Frogmore stands not as an isolated case, but as a precedent, a signal that the rules have not just been revisited, but reinforced. Yet even as this new order establishes itself, the story of Frogmore refuses to remain confined to policy alone, because in the end it was never just about a residence, never just about land or lease agreements. It was about meaning, about what the monarchy chooses to protect, and what it ultimately decides it must release in order to endure. The echoes of Queen Elizabeth's long-held vision of stability, of continuity, of quiet strength can still be felt within these decisions, guiding them in ways that are rarely spoken but deeply understood. And in that sense, Frogmore becomes something more than a turning point. It becomes a reflection of an institution evolving under pressure, reshaping itself while carrying the weight of its own history. There is, however, an undeniable cost to such evolution. Behind every structural decision lies a human consequence, a shift in relationships that cannot be fully measured or resolved. The emotional weight lingers, even as the institution moves forward with clarity and resolve. Because survival, in the context of the crown, has never been gentle. It demands sacrifice. It demands choices that place continuity above comfort, duty above personal ties. And in doing so, it leaves behind a legacy that is both powerful and complex, defined not by what was preserved, but by what was deemed necessary to let go. And so, as this chapter draws to a close, the significance of Frogmore continues to resonate, not as a controversy, but as a quiet declaration of intent, a signal that the monarchy, faced with a rapidly changing world, has chosen structure over sentiment, definition over uncertainty. Yet even within that certainty, questions remain, lingering at the edges of what has been decided and what has yet to unfold. Because in the world of the crown, nothing is ever truly personal, and every decision becomes part of history. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.